Okay, good evening and welcome to the most recent installment of Building the Scottish State here on the 29th of July 2021. And I have the good fortune to have with me this evening Mr. Tim Rideout, who is a specialist of currency and economics in general, and who is going to talk to us about what an independent Scotland could do on a fiscal and monetary basis. So, first of all, thank you, Tim, for being with us this evening.
Oh, thank you for asking me, Mark.
Okay, great. So just to begin with, tell us a little bit about your background in economics and finance.
Okay, well, I grew up on the Isle of Man, where we had a farm, and then in the mid-1970s, my parents decided to emigrate to South Africa. So I finished high school in Cape Town and then went to the University of Cape Town, which is one of the world's top 100 universities. And I did an arts degree, which the University of Cape Town was set up by Scots. It followed the Scottish system of a four-year honours degree and broad subjects. So in the arts faculty, I could do any course I wanted, and I did 3 years worth of economics, economic history, and 3 years of geography, a few side subjects of statistics, maths, computer science, geology, and then went on to do honours in economic geography before doing a master's again in Cape Town on the Cape Town Central Business District, and then came to Edinburgh in 1984, the end of 1984, to do a PhD again in economic geography, where I was looking at the effects of planning controls on office development in Edinburgh and Dublin as a comparative study.
Okay, and what did you find? I mean, you told me about your the subject of your thesis, but beyond just what you studied directly, what did you find about economics? What were the big kind of, the big picture lessons that you took from what from your research during your thesis?
Well, that was quite specific, and it was basically that a government legislative framework such as the planning system was actually a good thing for property developers, in that individual developers complained like hell because if they got a planning permission turned down. But in a free-for-all like Dublin, where planning permissions were just handed out in return for a brown manila envelope, then the developers lost out because they went through huge booms and busts. Whereas in Edinburgh, individual developers might not get all they wanted, but the regulation of the state ensured that the market was quite stable, didn't sort of overheat too much, didn't collapse, and whatever. So on the whole, you required both the private sector and effective government intervention and regulation.
Okay, and how do you? Okay, and so what we'd like to talk about this evening, especially, is can Scotland just, depending on how Scotland becomes independent, how would they achieve a, having their own currency, monetary policy? All of this seems very, kind of very difficult and complicated. Tell us about, in your own ideas, and how Scotland could, set up, have their own currency, have a central bank. Is it easy? Is it complicated? What is necessary in order for that to occur, in your view?
Well, I think before answering that, I'll just tell you a sort of tale about the expert, in that becoming an economist or any other sort of expert is a bit like entering the priesthood. What you have to do is to learn the sort of priestly language and the sacred texts.
Yes.
That once you've learned those, then in order to make out to everyone else that you're now the expert, you never ever say anything to anyone that they will understand, because you put it into all the jargon and so forth as much as possible, just make it obscure. And the less people understand what you're talking about, the more they assume you're a genius.
Even though you're not.
So exactly. So you need to just sort of understand that a lot of what economists talk about is really just hiding the truth so that they're kept in the job. I think for Scotland, setting up a currency and setting up a central bank is really quite straightforward. I think there's been something like 30 odd countries in the last since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that have set up their own currency and central bank. None of them had any great trouble about doing it. All the 60 states that obtained independence from Britain since the war have set up a central bank and a currency. They didn't have any trouble doing that. So a central bank is just, it's a bank where banks keep their money. It just needs a set of accounts, an accounting system. I mean, you could do it the old-fashioned way in paper books and ledgers if you wanted, but these days you just buy an accounting package, and you simply have to have an account that you maintain for each commercial bank. There's not very many of them, so
Yeah.
An account for the government. So unlike a normal bank that is dealing with millions of accounts, the central bank's probably only dealing with a few hundred accounts, and you just allow the account holders to make deposits and withdrawals and transfers from between those accounts. So
Sure. And in terms of creating a currency, I mean, of course, Scotland has had the pound, or for centuries with the English pound, for better for worse. How difficult do you see, like, just setting up a separate currency, setting up the separate central bank, and making it work seamlessly so that people can have their reserves in British pounds now, but then could be, transferred to Scottish pounds, and then, maybe float a little bit. But, how do you see that in the future, transferring over to a different currency?
Well, I think it's quite straightforward that, the plan that I've set out would see the work started. Preliminary design work has already started on the central bank via the Scottish Currency Group. But we can do a certain amount before we get to a referendum, but in terms of designs. But the main work would start after the referendum. The central bank would just commission a banknote printer to do the notes and coins. It's going to set up a suitable IT network that could handle the interbank payment system. And we don't have to write that from scratch, because we'll just adopt the European standard. So they have a system. I think there's a TIPS Plus and another one that they use for small payments and large payments. They already support multiple currencies. I've had it explained to me that it supports the Danish kroner, for example. They just have to add another currency in the form of the Scottish pound, and we have to connect up the banks in Scotland to that network so they can make payments from one to another, and to and from the central bank, of course. And therefore, we get to a stage where maybe 5-6 months before Independence Day, the commercial banks would contact you and send you a letter saying, you're a customer that we've identified lives in Scotland. Do you wish to have a Scottish pound account, credit card, so forth? If you say yes, then they'll set those up for you. If you're Ruth Davidson, you say no. She's going to keep her £320 a day or whatever from the House of Lords in sterling. So that's fine, because it's all voluntary. You don't have to convert any money into the Scottish pound if you don't want to. And about 2 months or so after Independence Day, it'll be like with when you get a new credit card, it has a start date on it. So, a month or two before the changeover day, you'll get your new cards and pay-in books, checkbooks, or whatever else you've asked for, the details for your new internet banking. And when the day comes, then it'll go live, and you'll be able to log in and start making online payments in Scottish pounds and using your new Scottish pound debit card in the shop. You can carry on using the sterling one without any penalty for a couple of months, but eventually it'll be a fairly short period. The Scottish pound will start to float. The bank is going to start charging you foreign exchange fees if you use a sterling card.
Yeah.
You'll find the shop doesn't really want to accept sterling.
And how do you see that going forward with either being in the EU or being in EFTA? Or what is your view on that? I mean, in our research group, we contacted EFTA, and they basically said that Scotland can be in EFTA if they want to, but they have, the government has to have competence over negotiating treaties and the powers to respect those laws, that kind of thing. But the contact I've had with EFTA has been very positive, and it's like, but as long as you have these competences, you can come on in. But I don't see in the Scottish government much urge. I don't know how to interpret it, but it's as if they're being dragged down this whole Brexit thing but they're not really doing much about it to mitigate the what's going to happen in terms of Brexit. I don't know what your view is, but you're welcome to expound on that.
My view, and I think the view of the SNP's Policy Development Committee that I sit on, is that Scotland should aim to be within EFTA from day one of independence. And that's the sort of realistic position that we could achieve. Rejoining the European Union is a different kettle of fish altogether.
It is, and as I said, I was in direct contact with with someone from the and the main thing is they said as long as Scotland has the power to, as long as the Scottish Parliament has the authority to negotiate international treaties and the powers to abide by them, they can easily apply and probably get membership in EFTA, which would reconnect Scotland with the European market. So I hope they consider that, but I'm not. Yeah.
Well, I think there's two things that should happen straight after a vote for independence, and one of those is that Westminster adds Scotland to the Statute of Westminster 1931.
Yeah.
The Statute of Westminster was the process by which Canada, South Africa, the Irish Free State, New Zealand, Australia became self-governing. And the Statute of Westminster just says that the Imperial Parliament, and they did call it the Imperial Parliament, would no longer pass legislation for the state concerned without the written consent of the Parliament of that state. So this is actually a binding thing on Westminster that although they would carry on passing the budget, for example, and other legislation, we would have to agree in writing to any provisions that would apply to Scotland. And the other thing that would happen would be to use a Section 30 order. And there's a great deal of misunderstanding about what a Section 30 order is. It is not permission to hold a referendum. It's an amendment passed by order in council, so that's the Privy Council, to alter what is in the Scotland Act 1998. So, for example, in 2013, or the Edinburgh Agreement, the order in council simply transferred power over the constitution temporarily to the Scottish Parliament, and then took it back again in December 2014. So a Section 30 order could be used to delete the list of reserved powers, all of them, from the Scotland Act. And that would mean that the Holyrood Parliament, A, it's not going to have Westminster doing things it doesn't want, and B, it can pass legislation in any area. For example, to set up the Scottish Defence Force, to establish the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and to pass the Scottish Reserve Bank Establishment Bill.
Okay, all right. And how do you view things like setting up a Scottish Defence Force, whether Scotland should be part of NATO? How do you see these things? Because it's not easy. I mean, of course, America is a big backer of the UK and Scotland a certain way. How do you see things like Faslane? Nuclear weapons, Scottish participation in NATO, these types of things. How do you see that in the future?
I don't have any hard and fast sort of thoughts on NATO. I think so long as we can adopt the position of some other countries and say that we wish to be in NATO but not have any involvement with nuclear weapons. Fine. If they're going to be difficult about that, then just be neutral, like Sweden or something. I think the Trident system has to be removed from Faslane, and there's no. Well, we would unquestionably have the power to do that. In that, on Independence Day, the Faslane base becomes the property of the government of Scotland, and the UK would have to negotiate an agreement for the continued use of that base, and I would say give them 5 years, charge them a rental for that period, maybe 50 million a year or something, and require that at the end of that 5 years the equipment and missiles and submarines be removed along with any UK forces.
Okay. Question: would the Scottish Stock Exchange relocate back to Scotland from down south? Or tell us about you've talked about a possible Scottish currency. What about a Scottish stock exchange? How do you see that? Would that be a beneficial thing to Scottish society? Is that something we should avoid? Measuring ourselves by the
No, I think that there should be a Scottish stock exchange. I mean, there was one, but in fact, Edinburgh and Glasgow had their own stock exchanges, but they merged with the London Stock Exchange and got closed down. As has happened repeatedly with Scottish businesses. I think there have been various proposals. Michelle Thompson, the MSP for Falkirk, she was involved with a proposal to try and re-establish a stock exchange, but it didn't happen. Having our own currency would make it much easier to have our own stock exchange, because then companies which operate in Scotland, Diageo, for example, they could then get a listing in Scottish pounds on the Scottish Stock Exchange, and people would be able to buy and sell shares in Scottish pounds. Whereas at the moment, without a Scottish Stock Exchange, then you'd be investing in a foreign currency in London.
Yeah. How easy is that to do? I mean, you think of, setting up a stock exchange, whether it's the FTSE or the Dow Jones. Oh, that must be so complicated. Is it? Or, because we think, maybe Scotland, they couldn't make their own, stock exchange. I know I'm being facetious, but all I'm saying is, how easy is it to do these things? Because it's always presented as something very complicated. Scotland, they couldn't possibly have their own stock exchange. No way. You know what I'm saying. But how do you say about in terms of the feasibility of your own currency, your own stock exchange, etc.? Go ahead.
The stock exchange is just a market for it's all over the computer system. So sure. It just allows people to companies can list their shares on the stock exchange, and then people can open an account with via a stockbroker or something like that, that then allows them to deal on that stock exchange, and the exchange makes some money as a commission out of the fees they charge the companies to be listed, and the transaction charges for whatever you buy and sell. It's not difficult. I think the difficulty is being economically viable, in that you have to have enough companies that wish to list on the exchange and enough people that wish to buy and sell to make it that your income as the stock exchange is big enough to cover the sort of infrastructure costs and your staff and so forth. That's where having our own currency makes it much more viable, because we then have much less competition from London.
Yeah. And how do you see setting up a new, I think of, going back to, the Bretton Woods back in 1945, the setting up the IMF and the World Bank, and this kind of world order pretty much led by the United States on, in terms of, debt. And, I know it's quite complex, but do you think that Scotland can kind of avoid that America-centric vision of how the international financial order works? Being an American, I do see how it works, and I'm wondering if Scotland can avoid that to a certain extent. I mean,
no, I don't. No, I mean, we're going to be subject to the international order, so I expect Scotland would join the World Bank. It would join, the Scottish Reserve Bank would join the Bank for International Settlements. And the Scottish Reserve Bank would have its accounts at the European Central Bank, at the US Fed, and so forth. Because if when the UK, for example, has dollar reserves, the dollar reserves are not in London; they're in New York in the US Fed.
Yeah, sure.
So the same thing would happen to Scotland. We would have dollar reserves; we would keep them in New York at the US Fed. And so we're not going to avoid the international system, but I think the US-centric nature is under challenge. The Chinese are challenging it very strongly.
To what extent do you think that Scotland should become involved in the U.S. system? I mean, this is completely hypothetical, and I don't expect that anything that I ask, is that you can predict on accurately. But How do you see that? I mean, do you see a US centric system, maybe going by the wayside, and Scotland being able to join some other
I think
kind of
we'd be more tied to the euro than the dollar.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And the infrastructure systems that we're proposing for the Scottish Reserve Bank are based on the design of the eurozone. So if we did rejoin the European Union and say in 10, 15 years time we wanted to join the euro, that we would be 100% compliant with the technical necessities for doing that.
Okay.
I don't recommend joining the euro, but certainly not at the moment. But we would be orientated towards Europe and not the US.
Sure. And what is necessary to set up a currency and for Scotland to get on their way to either joining the EFTA or the EU? I mean, and especially gaining independence, getting the capacity to join other international organizations, and doing so in terms of whether it's the EU or the UN. How do you see these things going forward?
Well, the UN is simple. We'd become a member of the UN on Independence Day.
Yeah.
The European Union is a difficult one. I think even with the European Union falling over backwards to help Scotland, which they probably will, it would take 4 years after independence before you could possibly rejoin.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Yeah.
And I think the First Minister sort of rather naive in saying, "Oh, we're just going to rejoin the EU," because we won't.
Yeah. Well, I've spoken to people from EFTA, and they're like, as long as the Scottish government can negotiate treaties and has the powers to abide by them, they can pretty easily join EFTA and rejoin the common market. But
that's the important bit, because then all this we're then back in things like the Erasmus scheme. Once
you join EFTA, you can join any you can pay into any European program, and whether it's Erasmus or whatever, it's all out there.
We'll have to be like Ireland. We'll need direct ferry links from Scotland to Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands. And then things like the shellfish, it will just go straight from Scotland to, probably to Belgium or somewhere, and on to France and Spain, and we'll just bypass the rest of the UK.
Exactly. Yeah. Has Dr. Rideout read Mark Blyth's book, Enignomics? Sorry. Yeah. Or heard Mark's take on our currency and when we're independent? He's well worth paying attention to. Do you have any comments on that, or just your own views of currency upon independence?
I'm aware of the book, but I haven't read it, and I'm aware of Mark Blyth. I think he still has a little bit to go on currency for Scotland, but I think he's now on Kate Forbes' new panel of advisors, and I think Mark actually is based in the US and is a professor at a US university. So he probably has a little bit of catching up to do on getting familiar with the situation in Scotland and what needs to be done. But I think, he's quite close to my position on currency.
Okay. Let's see. Next question. What assets of ours are in the Bank of England? And maybe we can just expand this a little bit more. Imagine there was some kind of referendum. The Scots voted yes to become independent. How do you see the, negotiation of assets and liabilities between England and Scotland, given 300 years or so of being part of the same union? How do you see the dividing of assets, of liabilities, whether military, all that? How do you see it? From a
basically, there's not much to negotiate. That might seem surprising, but the UK has already said that under the Vienna Conventions, for example, the 1978 Convention, it wishes to be the continuing state. And if you think back to when the Soviet Union collapsed, then the Russian Federation was the continuing state, and Estonia, Latvia, etc., were all completely new states. And under international law, there's two things that can happen. One, the old state disappears and the new countries all get a share of its assets, or in the continuing state model, the continuing state keeps all the assets and liabilities apart from what is within the territory of the new state. And the UK has already made clear in 2014, there's a whole paper they produced about it saying that they intend to be the continuing state. No, as usual, no discussion about that. They just said, we are going to be the continuing state, whether you like it or not. And they will always do that, because if you went down the other route of dividing the assets and liabilities, then the UK as a state in international law ceases to exist, which means the UN Security Council seat becomes vacant and would be reallocated to somebody else. And I'm afraid that's not going to be acceptable to the UK. The rest of the UK, they'd also have to reapply to the United Nations, which means they'd be treated as a new state subject to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and so forth,
and no longer a permanent member of the Security Council.
Yeah, all of that would disappear. So
it's probably the biggest reason they don't want Scotland to go. I mean, I think that's up there.
So if they're going to be the continuing state, that means that they keep the UN seat, they keep all the military equipment and so forth, they keep the Falkland Islands and Tristan da Cunha, and they keep all the embassies. And they also keep any debts and so forth. So the national debt stays in London. And they also have to pay the pensions of UK civil servants, not Scottish government civil servants, but anyone who's been a UK civil servant or ex-UK forces or things like that.
Sure.
What is in Scotland? So any UK property in Scotland, so the big new Union Jack adorned building in central Edinburgh becomes property of the Scottish government because it's here. Faz Lane becomes property of the Scottish government. The UK is allowed to remove any movable property. So if they have some fighter jets, missiles, submarines, paintings, things like that, they can take those away.
Okay, all right. And let's see. So, what assets of ours are in the Bank of England? What do you know about the repartition of Well, we talked about a little bit with assets and liabilities, but I mean, what is Scotland entitled to? I mean, whether there's a currency union or not a currency union, I have no idea. But how do you see that in terms of dealing with the Bank of England?
Under the continuing state model, we're not entitled to anything from the Bank of England. But I wouldn't, I wouldn't worry about that because there isn't very much. The UK's foreign reserves, which is basically what we're talking about, the gold, dollars, euros, whatever that the UK has. In August 2020, the total value was $88 billion US. So that's not very much. When you set it against the fact that there's 3.3 trillion of sterling, then if you liquidated the UK, you'd get 2 US cents per pound. Mm-hmm. And if you were going to try and claim 8% of the value of the Bank of England, you're talking about 8% of 88 billion, which comes down to about that's dollars. So that comes down to about £7 billion, which is neither here nor there. And we don't need it anyway, because when you introduce the new currency, you don't give it away free of charge. So everyone who wants a Scottish pound is going to have to pay for it with a sterling pound. So I estimate that on the first day or two of the new currency, something of the order of 40 billion Scottish pounds would be sold into existence. And that means that the Scottish Reserve Bank gets 40 billion sterling paid in for those.
Okay. And give us a scenario of how that could happen. I've never envisaged setting up a central bank, and I'm sure very few people have been able to. But okay, so let's just say Scotland will be independent or have a vote for independence within the next couple of years. What should we be doing, or what can be done now to set up a central bank that'll be that'll be available to everybody, that everybody could have an account in the central bank?
No, only we wouldn't have accounts at the central bank. The central bank would just do accounts for the banks and the government.
Okay.
For other central banks. So, as I say, it might have less than 1,000 accounts. The commercial banks, we would keep our accounts at the commercial banks, such as the Bank of Scotland or the Royal Bank of Scotland. And incidentally, the Royal Bank of Scotland, it's still a bank. It's still headquartered in St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh, and it basically doesn't do any business outside Scotland these days.
Okay.
It's a part of the NatWest group, but one thing that annoys me, people always forget. They talk about NatWest. Oh, what are you going to do about NatWest? It's too big. But NatWest Group is not a bank. It's a holding company. It owns lots of banks. It owns Ulster Bank, for example. It owns the Isle of Man Bank. It owns Coutts and Company, the Queen's Bank, and it owns Royal Bank of Scotland. What were Royal Bank branches in England have all closed down, and they're now either part of NatWest Bank or they just don't exist. And I looked at this recently. So the Royal Bank of Scotland is 11% of the NatWest group. Basically, it's all Scottish, and so that is going to be the biggest bank in Scotland when we're independent.
Okay. And given the laws of success, I don't know what the laws of succession would be, but if Scotland were to become independent tomorrow, what with the banks and with the financial systems, what would Scotland be obliged to take on, and what could they shed? I know that's a kind of a vague question, but but how do you see that? I mean, just in terms of what Scotland would be obliged to inherit in terms of the English banking system, etc.
Well, we inherit the banks which are registered in Scotland, so that would be things like the Royal Bank, the Clydesdale Bank, which belongs to Virgin Money, but it's still Clydesdale Bank is still legally a separate bank. It publishes its own accounts every year. The Bank of Scotland is legally a Scottish bank, publishes its own accounts, even though it's owned by Lloyd's Group. Things like Tesco Bank is actually a Scottish bank because it's headquartered in Edinburgh. But any bank that is operating in both countries, let's take Santander UK, they will have to split into two companies. So there would be Santander UK and Santander Scotland. And the English customers go into Santander UK and the Scottish customers go into Santander Scotland, which would be a separate company, but all owned by Santander in Madrid. And the Santander Scotland would be a registered bank at the Scottish Reserve Bank, headquartered, based in Scotland. A Scottish company would do its accounts in Scottish pounds, and it's going to provide accounts in the Scottish pound. If you want a sterling account, then you would get that from Santander UK.
Okay. All right. And do you see it as being relatively simple to set this up, or, because people seem to always, I don't know, whether it's the British state saying, oh, it's so complicated, Scotland could not possibly do this on their own. How do you respond to that of like, oh, well, it's, you're setting up a currency, it's too complicated. What do you say to that?
It's complete nonsense. The city of Bristol set up the Bristol pound, and I don't have one, but I've seen that they had proper banknotes printed. They're the same sort of quality as say the Scottish banks do. They're £5 note, £10 note, whatever, and you can spend them in Bristol, and you can go to the city council and you can change them into sterling, or you can take sterling and change it into the Bristol pound. If the city council in Bristol can do it, surely Scotland could manage it.
Okay. All right. And okay, assuming Scotland is able to, in the next, let's just say 3 years, have the opportunity to set up a Scottish pound, how would the exchange rate work? Would you base it on kind of pegging it to the pound sterling for the time being? And then how could, based on what you know about currencies that have been set up in the past, how do you see a future for a Scottish pound in terms of how it's created, how it's evolved, whether it's how it's pegged to the sterling pound at the beginning and how it kind of goes off from there, how do you see that?
Okay, well, the Scottish pound would be created at 1-to-1 against sterling. I mean, there is an argument for, say, lopping off a zero and having £10 sterling to £1 Scots, because we are in a situation where a pound. When I was at school in 1971, I could, at the tuck shop, I could get a fizzy drink, a pack of crisps, and a chocolate bar for 5 pence, which is 1 shilling.
Yeah.
So the pound's gone a bit down the toilet in terms of value. But I think that we can't do that, so we'll just have to have it as 1-to-1, and it'll be there'll be a transition period of about 2 months or so when you can exchange sterling into the Scottish pound free of charge and at the guaranteed 1-to-1 rate. And if that period will then end, and after that, the Scottish pound will float on the foreign exchange market. It'll find its own value. And if you're what I call a late exchanger, you've been a bit canny and waited to see what happens, and you've kept all your savings in sterling, you will then find that you get subject to a foreign exchange fee when you either ask your bank to convert them into Scottish pounds, or if you use a sterling debit card or credit card, it would be the same as if you're in Spain. You find that your statement says you've purchase something in Scottish pounds, which is going to be converted back to sterling at such and such an exchange rate, and plus 2.5% foreign exchange fee for the bank director's Christmas bonus fund. So it'll become inconvenient to keep your savings in sterling, and so therefore there'll be sort of people who are enthusiastic about the Scottish pound who will change their money immediately. There'll be a large tail of people who sort of wait a few weeks to see what happens, and there'll be still quite a lot who sort of do nothing at all during the 2-month fixed period, and then over the next couple of years gradually change their sterling into the Scottish pound. And what that does, by making it all voluntary and a gradual process like that, is it means that there's a guaranteed demand in the foreign exchange market for Scottish pounds. So there will not be many sellers. The only sellers are going to be people who are trying to pay for imported goods or going on holiday. And there's a lot of, in fact, there's going to be something like be about 140 billion pounds worth of sterling pounds that we own, which is not exchanged in the first few days, and which will follow over the next 2 years. So that's a huge demand for the Scottish pound against a quite small supply. So the Scottish Reserve Bank or the Scottish government are going to have to keep creating new Scottish pounds in order to accommodate that influx.
And I was raised on the idea that if the government is going to spend money, they have to get money from the tax, the taxpayers. So every year there's a certain amount paid in tax, there's a certain amount that's spent by the government, and there's a huge gap, and that's the deficit. And so there's this idea that all of government spending needs to be covered by taxes. But I have the idea that the sovereign governments could just create money like that. And if they want to create 100 billion to do this or that, they can do that. They don't have to necessarily tax the populace to get that amount of money to create an amount of money. They can just go like that and type in a few digits to a computer and get that amount of money, rather than say you have to take it from the taxpayers to get that amount of money. How do you see it? I'm curious as to how you see that, because it just seems to me as if this idea that we've been raised with, that every dollar that's spent by the government has to be raised through taxation. It just seems to me absurd, because it just seems to me like the U.S. or whatever government just can create as much money as it wants to out of thin air. But how do you see it?
Yeah, well, the what's termed the sort of neoliberal narrative. So that's the sort of right wing monetarist Reaganite sort of trickle down sort of school of people. Really came out of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics. The narrative that it's taxpayers' money, it never was taxpayers' money. Before the 1970s, nobody talked about taxpayers' money. It was the public purse. There was
Yeah.
public, and there is no such thing as taxpayers' money. Any taxpayer who creates their own money will get done for forgery. So it's the government's money. It's the people's money. We put the government in place to provide the services that the state provides to us, which is a lot. And the public purse is property of the people. All this taxpayers' money business was an attempt to privatize money and say it's not really the people's money; it belongs to some billionaire somewhere, and we're dependent on his gratitude. So the way that things work is that you have to spend first. Spending comes first, and tax comes at the end. And if you don't believe that, it's very obvious when you're looking at a new country.
Yeah.
If Scotland now becomes independent, new country, there are no Scottish. So if the Scottish government wants Scottish pounds to spend, how can they get them from taxpayers who don't have any? It's impossible. The only way that the Scottish pound comes into existence is by the government spending it. And in this case, they spend it to buy our sterling. And then they will spend more to pay the wages of the civil service and set up the Ministry of Defence and all the rest of it. So, spend comes first, tax is at the end of the process.
Okay.
I think there's a nice story I can tell, which maybe make things easy for people. There's standard policy in the British Empire when a new territory was conquered. Let's say we conquered Nigeria in the late 19th century. So the colonial administrators say, right, what we need a house for the governor and we need some roads. And they have a look round and they see some guys tilling the fields, growing maize, and say, oi, you lot, come and build this house and make the roads for us. And the farmers say, no, sod off, what are we going to do that for? So, we'll give you some shillings, these nice shiny coins with the Queen across the water on the no, we don't want those. What do we want shiny bits of metal for? No use here. So the colonial officials got a problem. So they call for the army, they send the army in, and they go and tell all the farmers, right, you've got 1 year to come up with 12 shillings in tax. Otherwise, we're going to come back and burn your house down. So now the colonial official goes back and says, well, I've got 12 shillings here, and if you spend a year building my road and my house, then I'll give them to you. And that's how you create a currency. You spend it, and you force people to use it by levying tax on them.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm just that's okay. Yeah, I hadn't heard it put that way before, but So how? If I was to say to you, okay, I have the authority, create a Scottish currency within the next 5 years that's functional. Could you do that? What would you suggest? How could you do that? If you were to say, again, you were given the orders, create a Scottish currency in the next 5 years that's workable and stable. Is that doable?
Well, the key thing is the central bank and getting the notes and coins made. And it takes a year to 18 months to get the notes and coins done. So that's the most time-consuming part of the process. It's not difficult, but getting your security features right and making sure that the Scottish pound coin isn't the same size as the 1 cent Thai baht.
Sure.
It takes a while, and it has to be usable by blind people, and all work in the vending machines and all this sort of stuff. So there's about 18 months of work that can be done in preparation before a referendum. So we really should be starting now, and I'm trying to get that off the ground. And that's just designed on the central bank and getting tender documents and sort of things like that. There's then about 2.5 years work up to before the central bank is in a position to launch the currency that would take place after the referendum. Most people seem to think it's going to be between 2 years and 3 years between the referendum and an Independence Day. So that works fine. And it will then be ready to go. The key thing is to make the currency a success. That although transferring your savings into the Scottish pound is voluntary, from the currency day when the currency is switched on, all Scottish government payments and receipts will be in Scottish pounds. Mm-hmm. So if you work for the civil service or the council or something like that, the Scottish Health Service, Fire Brigade, whatever, you are going to be paid in Scottish pounds, and you don't get a choice about that. Okay. And equally, all tax will be paid in Scottish pounds. So, Ruth Davison turning up with her £300 from the House of Lords to pay the council tax will find that it will not be accepted. Just as, if you go to HMRC and say you wish to pay your income tax bill in US dollars, they will not accept that.
Yeah.
It has to be paid in sterling. Same applies in Scotland. Any tax fines for speeding tickets, whatever, they will have to be paid in the Scottish pounds, and they will not accept sterling.
Okay. And is it that easy? Is it that complicated? I'm just trying to get a sense of it, because it always seems like, setting up a new currency, that would be so difficult. And what you're saying is completely logical. But what I'm kind of getting at is it that relatively straightforward that Scots could set up a currency without much problem? In a straightforward, logical manner that wouldn't induce catastrophe. The
only reason why it's a bit difficult is because most currency these days is not banknotes and coins. It's digital in bank account computer systems. If we didn't have bank accounts, it would be dead easy. All we'd have to do is take your notes and coins round to the post office or something, hand them in, get the new ones, and we'd all be converted to the Scottish pound in a day or two. But because it's mostly digital, then you need to have the appropriate IT systems and the software, the connections to the central bank, and make sure that works without being hacked or falling over because of some software problem or something like that.
Okay, all right. Going back to a couple of the questions. Can you explain? Maybe we covered this. Can you explain how the exchange rate would work? Let's just say that there was a Scottish pound set up relative to the UK, pound sterling. They were equal at the beginning. They were pegged at the beginning. How could you see that how could you see that evolving? In terms, if there was a new Scottish pound initially pegged to the pound sterling, how do you see that evolving over time?
Well, the Scottish Reserve Bank would keep the peg for about 2 months, and then they would allow the Scottish pound to float, which basically means it goes up and down on the foreign exchange market, depending on supply and demand. So it's simply a matter of how many people wish to buy the Scottish pound versus how many wish to sell the Scottish pound. And for people who talk about speculators and the international markets and things like that, at the start they don't have any Scottish pounds, and it's kind of difficult to deal in something which you haven't got. So they're not in a position to sell Scottish pounds because they don't have them. They'd have to buy them first. What people at this point, the unionists would always start screaming is, but futures contracts. Yeah, you can go into a futures contract and you can short sell the Scottish pound. So you don't have any Scottish pounds, but you agree to deliver 1 billion Scottish pounds in, say, 6 months' time. So that's a futures contract. So you're conducting a sale now, which will actually only take place in 6 months' time, and that will affect the market price of the Scottish pound because it looks like somebody's selling it. But you have to deliver on the contract. Well, firstly, there's a question: do I actually have £1 billion in order to buy the Scottish pounds in 6 months' time when I have to deliver to my customer? So the dealer may well ask you to put up collateral or some sort of guarantee that you can fulfill the contract. And if you can't fulfill the contract, you're going to get a penalty because you defaulted. And what you're hoping is that the day before you have to deliver your Scottish pounds, you can buy them more cheaply than you sold them. But that's obviously a gamble. And if the Scottish Reserve Bank saw that the Scottish pound was going down a bit, they could use some of their foreign reserves to intervene in the market and push it back up. In which case you end up with what's called the bear trap, where the speculators get a bloody nose because they find that they can't buy the currency that they need to deliver on their contracts, and there's a mad scramble, and they all end up losing money. And that's what happened with oil, if you remember, in April 2020, when people were so desperate to give away oil that they'd agreed to accept delivery of, that they ended up paying people to take it away. I think the oil price went to minus $30 a barrel at one point. So those speculators lost a fortune.
Yeah. Let's see. Would following an Icelandic model not be better for Scotland? Maybe in terms of EU or EFTA. How do you see Scotland in Europe in the future? And do you think that EFTA EEA would be a better route, or trying to become a member of the European Union? How do you see it? Go ahead, take your time.
I think I would advocate the Norway position. So that's in EFTA and the European Economic Area, but not in the EU, so that we retain control over fisheries, for example.
Yeah.
That basically gives you, most of the advantages of the European Union without some of the disadvantages.
Yeah.
I think one reason why I think it's not straightforward to just rejoin. Well, what I would say is, shortly after independence, we should have a second referendum, and that should ask people if we should apply to join the European Union.
Yeah.
I think the answer to that would be yes. So then there begins a 4-year process of negotiation with the European Union, but that's not straightforward because people
not at all. And joining EFTA would be relatively straightforward. I actually had conversations with
So I think that we could be in the Norway position from Independence Day.
Yeah, I agree. All we have to do is ask. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the European countries are like out there. They're like, dude, Scotland, just go for it, man. We'll recognize you. You got to take the steps yourself. People can't do it for you.
By going down the Statute of Westminster and removing the list of reserved powers route, then during the 2-year transition period, the Scottish government can negotiate treaties and deal with an application to EFTA, for example. In terms of what the European Union, what people need to remember is we've lost all the UK's opt-outs, and we're unlikely to get them back. So, if we rejoin the EU, we have to follow EU VAT rules, and that means 5% VAT on everything. So, you're immediately talking about a 5% increase in the cost of food, children's clothes, books, newspapers, things like that. That's not going to be very popular. We'd have to go back into the fisheries policy, which again, that's not going to be popular with some people. And there's all sorts of other snags along the way. So I don't think it's straightforward to negotiate rejoining the EU.
But do you think it's worth it? I mean, do you?
I would go, but I think we might, at the end of the 4 years, decide that the offer wasn't really quite acceptable, and we just stay as Norway does.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, we're running to the end of it, but what else would you like to say in this interview before we sign off? What are your views on whatever you want to talk about?
Well, I think in terms of the other questions people always ask, so they talk about the border between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And obviously, in 2014, that would have been easy because we were all in the single market and there would have been no need for any controls or restrictions. Unfortunately, and it's not our fault, it's the rest of the UK's fault, with them going off to a hard Brexit position, turning that border into what's going to be the edge of the European single market, then there are going to have to be some controls. We're still in the 1922 common travel area, so nobody's going to need a visa or work permit, but we will have exactly the same as whatever happens in the end with Northern Ireland. Yeah. So if you want to know what the border between Scotland and England will look like, it'll look exactly the same as the border between Northern Ireland and England.
Yeah. And how do you see that working out? The Northern Ireland Protocol, the dispute between the EU and the UK over that. How do you see that working out? Because I don't know. From my vantage point, it's not good. I mean, the UK just seems to seemingly dismiss out of hand what it signed up to do, and that can't give any confidence to any country that it wants to sign a free trade deal with. If they can't even respect their own engagements in terms of the Irish Protocol, how can they respect their engagements in terms of any free trade deal that they might sign with other countries in the world?
Well, I think everyone every other country can see that the UK negotiates in bad faith and can't be trusted on its agreements. And that's not new. The UK signed a tripartite agreement with Ukraine in was it, I think, 1993 or something, when Ukraine agreed to give up the nuclear weapons that it inherited from the Soviet Union. And the UK and the US and Ukraine signed an agreement that we would guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And when Russia invaded the Crimea, what did the UK do? Absolutely nothing. So they didn't follow their agreements previously, and so it's not new. But I think they're going to discover that the European Union does not get messed around. The European Union is not.
No, I agree. Yeah,
and if the UK is going to be silly, then they'll just get trodden on. The European.
Well, yeah, they're going to be hauled in. They're going to be hauled into international court if they don't abide by their international agreements. For example, the Irish Protocol. We'll see how that works out. But the British aren't used to that. They've bestrided the world in their imperial gowns for so long, and they're just not used to playing second fiddle to anything. That's my view, in terms of the way.
No, I was hearing a story the other day about I think one of the early cross-channel sort of booze cruise type things, and some guy goes off to Boulogne, and he's walking down the high street and saying, "Why is this bloody place so full of foreigners?" Meaning the French. But no, I mean, but if the European Union simply said that we will not allow eurozone financial transactions to take place outside the European Union, then they could just take away half of London's business at a stroke. So the UK it's not in a strong position at all. It's a weak position.
No, exactly. I mean, they can't demand anything. And I remember, them saying, "Oh, we'll get another deal with India and and Australia and New Zealand." The kind of recreating the empire or something like that. And it's not like India or Australia has any great desire to get back with the UK in terms of this kind of empire type relationship. But I'm sure that in the kind of the British imperial mentality. Oh, they love us. The Australians love us. We were their colonial masters for so long. Of course, they'll want to sign big free trade deals with us. But I don't see it that way. We'll see what happens.
No, I can adapt an old joke. So now here's the news. New space triumph for Britain as the Indian astronauts on the way to the moon operate the waste disposal system over at Bognor Regis.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that. But thank you so much for being with us this evening, and I hope to have you back soon.
You're very welcome.
All right.